have extra rolls of Scotch tape?
I think so. Okay. I'm just in the middle. It might. There should be something in the box up there. Here, here's some tape. Do you want some? Here.
I need some downstairs in the kitchen.
Okay, well, I'll get some more.
Oh, do you want me to heat up soup for you?
Yeah, thanks.
Of us and whether or not we have a real sense of duty to God is alive with us. And if it is, if we do have a sense of that kind of commitment and duty and relationship to God, and we'll speak about the other aspects of that relationship, what should it mean? What should it mean to you all in Toronto, connected to Holy Blossom, with such an incredible history and a history of scholarship and a history of rabbinic leadership? And what does it mean to us here and now, given that teaching and given the history of Holy Blossom? And what does it mean as we move forward, especially in this time of crisis? And it has not appeared in my mind less than 100 times how much Borowitz is beginning in his initial writing in the early 1960s. He talked about the theology that he was suggesting, and he actually coined many of the terms that we'll be talking about today, that theology was, in his mind, and I think even more so now in mine, a crisis theology, a theology that was new and different because of the crisis of the Jewish people. Borowitz, I'll say a few words of background, and maybe Mark, if you can pull up the PowerPoint. I don't know if you're able to, but I don't seem to be able to. We can cue ourselves through some slides. I just want to give an introduction to Rabbi Borowitz. He was born Eugene Bernard Borowitz. He was born in New York, but raised primarily in Columbus, Ohio. And he always insisted on using that middle letter B because he was named for an uncle who had no children. And so you'll see wherever, thank you so much, wherever his name is listed, it is always that B. And I think it's significant that I knew him so well and was his student for many years and counted him as my mentor for 20 some years and have studied his thought and written about it. I find it significant, especially on such a sacred day, to speak about the ways in which his philosophy, his theology, and even his name was about carrying forward the most powerful parts of our tradition. So he was raised in Columbus. He, at a very young age, went to the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, founded there in 1875. He studied philosophy and all kinds of other things, graduating very early at the Ohio State University in Columbus. And he felt, this is a very important premise of his theology and of his thinking, that all of the ways in which professors of philosophy and all the rabbis that he had met until that time, whenever he asked them, questions about Judaism, he writes that he always felt that they should have had better answers, and that he would make it his life's work to help deepen and make more sophisticated the ways in which Jews could respond to their tradition, be able to ask questions and hear a whole pluralistic spectrum of responses. And also he was very important to him that the tradition become much more alive. And so he's ordained at the Hebrew Union College in 1948. And you can see he's very much still a young man at that point. And ordained in 1948, he is studying in Cincinnati, where the view of theology was primarily historical, and the theology was very much rationalist. It was based on the theology of Hermann Cohen and of Immanuel Kant. His teachers were very much historians. And he tells the story about how he and Arnold Jacob Wolff and others Arnold Jacob Wolf of blessed memory is probably also a name you might recognize, but they would even hide in the library when they learned about Buber, about Martin Buber, one of the most important and early modern existentialist philosophers, the author most famously of I and Thou, and also an early Zionist and humanist. But they would hide reading about different ways of understanding the experience of God, realizing that they felt that their teachers had essentially been only teaching them a small sliver of what really Jewish thought and Jewish theology should be about. And so, Mark, if we can move forward in our images in our PowerPoint, I want to just take you through, all of us through very briefly an overview of some of the main ways that I think there might be a slide or two before that, maybe not.
Yeah,
The main ways in which he thought about and spoke about that theology. So one of the early ways that he spoke about it was he would ask, what would it mean? Here it is, thank you. This is a picture of him around 1948. I think it's really wonderful to also have the image of the person around the time that they wrote and authored in his case, his early books and his early questions. And you see here, this is the question we've already begun with, right? What would you do, right, as a liberal, as a non-Orthodox Jew, when you have a serious relationship with God? That's what he would always ask us as rabbinic students, right? If you actually feel God's commanding presence, what does it mean? And his theology grows, right? It's significant that this is after 1948. It's after American Jewry and world Jewry has experienced the most significant blow and near annihilation, the most significant blow since the destruction of the Second Temple, really, and the loss of 6 million people, 6 million Jews, and many more human beings. And he felt, as did others of other denominations, that in fact the theologies that they had until that point, and I want us all to have very much in mind our own reality. They in their reality felt that a real break had happened in the world, that the Holocaust and of course the establishment, gloriously the establishment of the state of Israel, that those were significant moments, so significant that for liberal Jews to say that we're going to continue with our ethical monotheism, right? That which our early leaders were so wedded to, this idea of Judaism being primarily about ethics, and then of course later about social action or social justice, that was really to fail to understand the problem if we would just carry on those things. That the problem is that what was murdered at Auschwitz wasn't God, right? Taking that image from Elie Wiesel, who Borowitz also worked with about these ideas, that famous and horrific image that Elie Wiesel has in Night, that they see God hanging in the gallows at Auschwitz-Birkenau. But that Borowitz says what really was murdered there was a false Messiah, the false Messiah of modernity. That modern Jews thought that modernity was going to save us. They thought that modernity, in all of its ways, that it had opened the universities and opened society and opened even the highest forms of government to Jews, that was our saving force in the world. But of course, if you think about it this way, and this is how Borowitz explains it, that is a false Messiah, because all of the knowledge, all of the scientific knowledge, the country with great music and great culture and great philosophy and great science, that, Dafka, specifically, was the country in which we found ourselves where? We found ourselves on trains bound for Majdanek, for Auschwitz, for Treblinka. So clearly modernity cannot be our savior. And if you look at this way of thinking about modernity from an American perspective, right, as Americans are learning what the war had meant exactly, not only for humanity, but for Jews, from an American perspective, the war was also an experience of knowing that, hopefully you can still hear me even though you may not be able to see me, that not only did we find ourselves at Auschwitz, but we found ourselves as Americans dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We find ourselves in humanity with the experience of being in those places, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and all through Europe, that the human capacity to cause such suffering and use science in that way was in fact a demonstration of how modernity has failed us. And so Borowitz and other colleagues, actually initially at the invitation of David Hartman of blessed memory, one of my great teachers and also a rabbi. I worked with David Hartman at the Hartman Institute for about 15 years, and he was very influential in my life for over 20 years, actually over 25 years. So Hartman is a rabbi in Montreal, and you, as Canadians, may know more about Hartman than other folks may have known until recently. But Hartman invites Elie Wiesel, Borowitz, Fackenheim. Okay, these are huge, tremendous scholars. Yitz Greenberg, who I know you know something about as well. He invites them to meet with him to speak about this crisis. And Borowitz in the late 50s. And Borowitz is really the first one who is able to coin the new term that was needed. The new term that was needed, of course, is covenant theology. So in covenant theology, there is a different view of humanity and a much more centralization or a focus on God as the center of a theology, not the human being, not rational thinking, but in fact, God should be at the center. And so what we see is that he begins to write, including the book that, among the things that, the book that Mark has, and he writes first in Commentary Magazine an article called Crisis Theology, and then he writes another piece in which he actually coins that term covenant theology to respond to the fact that Judaism can no longer be either halakha or ethics. And that is, in a sense, what it had become. It had become a religion that was focused on either of those two things. And Borowitz felt that it was clear that liberal Jews, right, even if some of us may be more halachic or more focused on those details of the law, that halakha was not going to be, it couldn't be the focus of a liberal Jewish commitment. That isn't going to be that which claims us and binds us to Judaism. So if we move forward in our slides, Borowitz begins to describe what this covenant theology might mean. And here you see it in his first coining of the term in 1961 in Commentary. This system might be called covenant theology, for it rests upon a reaffirmation in contemporary terms of the covenant of Sinai and its renewal during the centuries of prophetic leadership. And we'll speak more about this in a moment, but you can jump forward. I want to make sure that we also have enough time to speak. But you see he's beginning to bring together different aspects of Jewish theology from a covenantal perspective, meaning it's about a commitment, not so much to ideas, but to the existence of God, a commitment to the Jewish people, and also a modern sense of the self. So what's also happening in America and throughout the world at this time is, as we see, not only a beginning of a postmodern rejection of modernity, as we just described it, but also such an embrace of autonomy that he sees that it almost becomes absurd. And here's how he writes about it. It once seemed so obvious that autonomous moderns would make a place for religion in their lives. If we modernized our old rites and made self-commending what God's will once imposed upon us, right? So there was an expectation that we would still be able to do that just out of our own autonomy, out of our own self-commanding, a sense of our being a sovereign self, we would choose that. And then he says, as long as liberalism emancipated us from the tyranny of old orthodoxies, its innovations elicited enthusiasm, right? It was such an exciting time, all of that innovation in early reform. But as a once repressive culture advanced to permissivism, freedom became more our problem than our redemption. And so he's defining there for us, he actually wrote something like this in the 60s and again in 1984. What he's defining for us is that while we may be liberated by this sense that the individual self has such a place and such a role and so much of a focus that really it's all about what our own, right, thanks to Kant and others, that it's our own conscience that should mandate to us what is actually right in religion. And so Borowitz is saying, well, that autonomy is really kind of run amok because it actually doesn't necessarily lead us to choosing the best of religion, right? It really has led a culture to a kind of destructive permissivism where we can choose anything and everything and nothing to be committed to. If we move forward in the slides, Mark, I'm so grateful for your help. One of the things that's, of course, happening in America in the 1960s, particularly in 1963 and 64 and 65, is, of course, the civil rights movement. It was a very divisive time in America, in the United States, a very divisive time and bloody and violent, particularly in the South. It was very clear that the Jim Crow laws and all of the things that the previously enslaved population had faced, they were continuing to face such injustices in very deep ways. Separate schooling, separate and certainly not equal schooling, separate bathrooms. They weren't allowed to eat at the same lunch counters. African Americans, Black Americans, or Negroes as they were called at the time. We weren't allowed to sit together, to pray together, to swim in swimming pools together, to go to the same beaches. Some of you may remember some of the horrific images. So Martin Luther King calls to the CCAR to reform rabbis and says that we Reform rabbis should join him in a march in St. Augustine in Florida in 1964. And he calls to the rabbis, and a number of them, actually 16 of them, decide to go, even though it was clear that it was very dangerous. And they join Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the leaders, the religious leaders of many faiths who were now understanding that religious people needed to stand up in such times. And so they went to St. Augustine to be part of this peaceful demonstration of really of civil disobedience. And they joined with their Christian colleagues, and they did the very radical act of sitting with Blacks at lunch counters, at prayer, and here at beaches. And here you have a picture of, I don't know if you can see it, hopefully you can, that this is a picture of, an integrated swimming pool, where, not integrated, it was a demonstration, right? White people, including some of these rabbis, are swimming in the same swimming pool as Black people. And what you see, there's a person jumping in there. This is from the New York Times in June 1964. You see a police officer jumping in to arrest them. So eventually the police, in a very violent way, arrest 16 of these rabbis, and they take them to jail in St. Augustine. You can imagine all of the other kind of violence that's happening and how bloody that time was. And they put 16 rabbis in a jail cell together in a sweaty, St. Augustine summer. They had one light. They had initially no paper. Eventually they got one paper and one pencil. And they asked Eugene Borowitz to be the one to write the letter for the New York Times. They felt that if they were going to be in the press, they wanted to explain why we went. Why did we risk our lives at such a moment? And so this is an excerpt. If we turn to the next slide, this is an excerpt from their letter, which is so powerful. We came because we could not stand silently by our brother's blood. We had done that too many times before. We have been vocal in our exhortation of others. But the idleness of our hands too often reveals an inner silence. Silence at a time when silence has become the unpardonable sin of our time. We came in the hope that the God of us all would accept our small involvement as partial atonement for the many things we wish we had done before and often. We came as Jews who remember the millions of faithless people who stood quietly, watching the smoke rise from Hitler's crematoria. We came because we know that second only to silence, the greatest danger to man is loss of faith in man's capacity to act. That's just an excerpt from what is a much longer piece in the New York Times. You can find it online. I'm happy to share it. But as you see, friends, this is the extent to which the rabbis who went, it became very clear to them amongst this violence and being arrested. And friends, this is a year before Heschel and other rabbis get involved. This is a whole year before that picture of Heschel, that famous picture of Heschel marching with Martin Luther King and Selma and saying, "I felt as though my legs were praying," a phrase you all, I imagine, know well. This is 16 rabbis being thrown in jail for being part of saying these human beings are equal. And for Borowitz, this becomes, I think, a real turning point, his sense that any theology to be worth anything in our reality, in his reality, and in that beginning of a postmodern period, meaning a sense that modernity really needed to take the gifts of it, but move forward into a new stage of thinking about God, that it had to matter. It had to be something that really claims us and causes us. This is our question today on this Rosh Hashanah Shabbat day. The question is, what still claims us, and what does it mean? If we feel commanded not to be silent, if we believe that there is a greater ethic or a greater sense of ethics that grounds our existence, then what does that mean? And what are its sources? And what are those commitments? What does it mean about God? What does it mean about the Jewish people? And what does it mean about whether or not there's any limitation on our autonomy? Right? Modern people, we're never going to let go of all of our autonomy. Right? We can assure you, I talk about this with some of my Orthodox friends all the time, right? That even the most Orthodox person may consult the halacha and consult the rabbi, but in most cases, if that's not an instruction that sits well in their conscience, well, they'll go ask another rabbi, right? So ultimately, all human beings are making a choice. And in fact, ultimately, we can say, especially on this Rosh Hashanah day, that Judaism is very much about a commitment to the individual's integrity and the individual's dignity. So it becomes very clear to Borowitz that the theology has to mean something. So he spends really the next several decades, 4 decades really, developing his theology. And he now, in 1964, he has been a rabbi for a few years in St. Louis and in New York. He's now the head of education at the UAHC. And he is, at this point now, already a teaching and an assistant professor at the Hebrew Union College in New York, where he would go on to teach for about 40 years. Actually, about 50 years, what am I saying? At least 50 years. He just passed away, and seems like very recently, and also a long time ago, in 2016, and actually was on his, around his first yard site, I believe, that I was last there with all of you at Holy Blossom, speaking about Dr. Borowitz. If you move to the next slide, you see that one of the ways that he wanted this thinking to have an impact on America and have a pluralistic voice. It was never, for him, it was never really about Reform Judaism only. In fact, I would say that it wasn't even really primarily about Reform Judaism. It was about Judaism altogether in America, and whether or not our freedom and our access to power and our access to being influential leaders and thinkers, whether or not that was going to mean something. And so he establishes a magazine after getting frustrated with commentary not really being pluralist, but really being so much more traditionalist and so much more neoconservative, I guess we would call it today. He felt that it was very important to create another journal, a place where the voices of a much wider spectrum could be shared, and that he wasn't seeing that happening in America. And so in 1970, he creates Shema, which, by the way, goes on to be a journal actually until just a few months ago. He single-handedly published it for a couple of decades, and then it was continued until very recently. And he says in this opening statement that he created Shema in order to create a space for a vigorous dialectic of opinion. If we could learn to listen to one another, particularly when we are in fundamental disagreement, we might thereby give a sign of how society can become community. This, of course, strikes us all. It strikes me now as being very powerful in our time. Where are the places where we can engage friends in a rigorous dialectic of opinion? Right? In every context, or certainly in every congregation, there's always those places of, where and when can we really speak to each other, and how important it is that we be able to do that, particularly, as Borowitz says, when we are in fundamental disagreement. And what does it mean to be able to do that and have a place, in this case, a journal of how to do that? Next slide, please. In 1974, just a few years later, he wins the National Jewish Book Award for The Mask Jews Wear, really about the ways in which Jews present their identity in America of being both Americans and Jewish, and the complexity of that identity. We can move to the next slide. So here are the basic aspects of this autonomous Jewish self, and after this slide, we'll show one more diagram, and then we'll open for questions. In this initial, you can see his ultimate theology having its roots in this initial explanation of the autonomous Jewish self. Okay, there's the autonomous human being who we know, right, has freedom, absolute freedom to be their own sovereign self. But an autonomous Jewish self, someone who's Jewish and not only a human being, but particularly Jewish, is different. Number one, a Jewish self is personally and primarily involved with God. The Jewish self will be concerned with the community. That's two, right? That's others. And three is going to be very important here as well, and it's a source of so much discussion for us. The Jewish self is historically rooted as well as divinely and communally oriented. We ought to behave like those who preceded us, which is very powerful to think about today, and thus substantially rely on their guidance in determining our Jewish duty. So we're blessed, right? We're blessed. We have all these traditions, all these prayers that we said this morning, all these things that we read. We have a huge, vast library of halakha to help guide us. And a liberal Jew should be rooted in that, right? He would always say, to be a serious liberal Jew is to know all of the major texts and to be substantially guided by them in determining what our duty is. It's not that we see them as irrelevant or pick and choose the nice sweet pieces that we like, but we're so historically rooted in them. And what he'll say later is that we are rooted in them because we are rooted in our commitment to the Jewish people of the past, right? It's not so much the text, the book. It's that we're connected to how the people who wrote those texts, including the multiple editors of the Torah and all of halakha, all of rabbinic literature and halakha as it's developed and come down to us to this very day. It's how those authors understood their duty. And in our commitment to the Jewish past and to the ways in which we've best explained our understanding of what God wants of us, we have a covenant not only with God, but with the Jewish past. We also, he'll go on to say, we have a commitment to the Jewish present, right? We can't do anything that the community can't withhold, can't uphold, that we can't stand, right? We're not going to walk 10 miles to shul. We might walk one. We might certainly walk a few blocks. We want to be of the world so much that keeping kosher in an orthodox way for most of us is not going to be possible, because we want to be able to eat, even if we eat in our, or particularly if we eat in our kosher style or in our vegetarian style and at other homes and in restaurants. We do that being both rooted in the ideas of the past and also in our commitment to live fully as part of the community today. And then the question is about, are we committed not just to the past and to the present, but are we committed to the Jewish people of the future, right? Are we, when we change things like our liturgy, for example, do we have in mind not just our own current aesthetics and love of a particular kind of music or spirituality? And when we have ceremonies, are we thinking about what the impact is on the future? And of course, the example that he ends up wrestling with really from the 1990s to the end of his life was a question such as rabbinic officiation at an intermarriage, right? That becomes a place where, while we might understand in the present the need and the call and the possibility of intermarriage as we know it, it's certainly not necessarily leading to only negative things to the Jewish people, but in many cases, intermarriage is saving us. It certainly saved the reform movement in America in terms of its numbers and affiliation because of outreach, and it certainly has ensured that many children are brought up Jewish who otherwise may not be. But whether or not a rabbi officiates at intermarriage, he thought was initially, his initial stand is that it was, as he called it, beyond the limits of his capacious pluralism, meaning his pluralism is very wide, but there are limits to it, right? The limits being that we don't have humanist congregations to this day are not admitted to the URJ, that there are things that are really far beyond the pale of even a broad tent. And so that's about a commitment to the future. So he initially felt that intermarriage was something that would create so many problems for the Jewish people in terms of identity and status in the future that Reform rabbis shouldn't engage in it. And he gradually came to a slightly different perspective toward the end of his life. So to be a liberal Jew, and according to this theology, is to not only have a deep sense of God's claiming of us and calling to us and our sense of duty, but we have a duty to the Jewish people past, present, and future. And the third, and really most radical part of his theology is that he's saying that in our covenant theology, we also have a significant commitment to the Jewish self, to the individual, to our own dignity. And as he puts it here in 1984, the Jewish self is sensitized to more than the present and its call to decision. All persons, as I see it, but certainly Jews, should put the immediate exercise of autonomy into the framework of attaining personal integrity. So what he's saying really is that the Jewish self has these very significant covenantal commitments, but among those commitments is also a commitment to the sovereign self, to the dignity of the individual. One more slide. I think there's a slide with a diagram on it. I'm now not sure if it's this one or the next. There we go. So this is the diagram with, thank you so much, Mark, with really how one could simplify, and with apologies, I know this is an oversimplification and a complicated one at that, but it's a Venn diagram that shows us all of these commitments. And what we don't see is how the lines of all the other circles are complete as well. And that right in the middle there, where there's that overlap, is what I often teased him as the crucible of being a liberal Jew, right? Because you could be all about God, let's say that's the bottom circle, the one that's complete, but we're also about the Jewish self, we're also about the Jewish people, and we have to take into account the needs of the individual. Once you've taken all of that into account and seriously considered all of the books and ideas produced by and credited to all these three different groups, then and only then can you make a decision. And Borowitz would say, but that is truly, you would be this is what we need. We need everyone to be able to be the one who can paskin their own, who can make a decision maker, a posek of our own Jewish existence and for our own communities. So this is what he spent a good half century, at least, teaching and modeling and challenging us to do, is to engage in this, really this threefold covenant, and to see that if we err too far in any of those directions, we would end up in another field of thought, right? Like I'm very involved in the Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood. He argued, I think somewhat erroneously, that essentially Kaplan's theology about God as being the source or the power within us that makes for freedom and for wisdom and for hope, that's essentially not a divine sense. It's not a compelling sense of a God that is outside of us, commanding us. So he would say that Kaplan is essentially erring on the side of peoplehood. You could say that secular Zionism is also erring in that direction. He would say that Buber was erring too far in the direction of it being all about I and thou, that's all about me, right? About the individual's existential experience. And of course, if you're only about God, then you stop caring about other people and you're always about just doing for God as you understand God's word. So erring in any of these three directions becomes problematic. It's really the integration of all three that is the foundation for a significant Jewish theology for a postmodern era. And I submit to you today, on this day of Rosh Hashanah, that there is much here to continue to challenge all of us. And I now I pause and I welcome your responses, your questions, your recommendations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi Rachel. I'm going to thank you. That was wonderful. You mentioned also Rabbi Emil Fackenheim, and I think maybe most people here probably know that Rabbi Fackenheim from Toronto also had a close association with Holy Blossom, and was also a dear colleague and friend of Rabbi Plautz and Heinz Warschauer, and he also taught us at Holy Blossom as well. So let's open it up to questions. There's only 20 of us, so I'm going to unmute everybody, but what I suggest is perhaps, some people don't have their video on, so I can't see you. So if you do want to ask a question, perhaps you could just in the chat let me know, and then I'll call on you. And others, if you're on the screen and I see you, raise your hand and I'll call you. So we'll have some semblance of order in our questions. So who would like to begin asking some questions or making a comment? Yes, Peter, please.
Well, thank you, first of all, Rabbi, for very intriguing and inspiring, inspiring my chocolate.
Be well is the main thing.
I appreciate it. I have to admit that it's very unique reform approach, which I never heard. Being member of reform movement, I just didn't have opportunity to study Borowitz, and I'm amazed with your teaching. I wanted to ask you about Borowitz at the end of his life, how he saw the results of his teaching, and if you can maybe mention some of the statements at the end of his life, how he see himself, the future of Jews, and his own teaching, and future of Reform movement.
Well, those are just a few small questions, Peter. Thank you. I'd be happy to send you the. I'm half kidding, but I'm also serious. Happy to send you the table of contents to the book that I'm working on about this. That question is a significant one. I think as someone who actually I was part of the last 5 lectures that he gave, we did a series which you can actually find online at the Hebrew College if you just type in Borowitz's name, and if you type in mine, you'll see together you'll see a series that we did very much toward really the last year of his life. He there you can see, and they're recorded lectures. You also see what he was like at the end of his life. In fact, we have some pictures here that we can share. He was very torn about 2 issues. He saw as his life's work, if his life's work was to put God more at the center of Reform theology, I think that was largely a success. Even if you look at, especially if you look at, I know you have your own prayer book, which is so wonderful, but for those of you who may have been familiar with the Union prayer book and with Gates of Prayer and now Mishkan Tefillah, or even your own prayer books and Masorim, there's a very significant move toward a greater focus on God. And a greater focus on Hebrew, and a greater focus on Zionism. So all of these things that are a result of his theology and his influence, I think, did have an impact, and he recognized it. He didn't always agree with it. He also worried sometimes at the period when we were in the 90s, when there was a swing of American reform back toward spiritual life and more religious practice. He would worry that we would make too far of a swing and lose a commitment to ethics and some of the important things of the previous era. He saw this as being sort of a third stage in the development of reform. Reform piety in its third stage is actually how he speaks about it when he wins the Eisendrath Award. Some of you may remember that. There are 2 issues that I think are kind of unfinished business that he was working on to finish. One is how to understand a rabbi's role in intermarriage, and the other was how to understand the issue, which he was clearer on a number of years before he passed, but how to understand whether or not a human being who is not heterosexual, whether or not they could be a rabbi. And the movement moved more quickly on that than he did. The school moved more quickly. Hebrew College moved more quickly on that than he did. And so there are actually a number of years in the late 90s when colleagues, friends and colleagues who were openly identified as being gay, lesbian, bisexual. I don't think we had people identifying as trans or queer at the time. But open and Borowitz felt that he couldn't sign their smichas, the klaf, the document of rabbinic ordination, and so there are those in later years that you can ask Rabbi Splansky about this also, but there are those in later years that wouldn't even ask him for his signature because he wouldn't sign all of them. But I was with him in the last few years of his life where he felt that the reason he couldn't abide by that initially was that he felt that a rabbi should model an ideal Jewish life, right? That we should all be, we could be male or female, but we should all be married and have children. And our household should exemplify the ideal of Judaism, the ideal for the Jewish family. And it took him a long time, and I think he had some shame about it, but he also stood by his thinking to understand that human beings of all different gender identities and sexual orientations can lead ideal lives, and that many were having families, and that their homes and their families were at least as ideal, if not more so, but at least as ideal as anybody else's. And so students would come and ask colleagues, people who'd been ordained, for over a decade, came back to him with their, unframed their smicha documents or ordination documents and brought them to him to sign. So I think I've pointed to a few areas, Peter, obviously I could say much more about this, but where his thinking was evolving. And I think for a scholar to be able to do that as society and as community changes and evolves is a very important model.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Judy Adler.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your teaching. It really is eye-opening. I want to read more. Where do I start? What book would you recommend? Rabbi Borowitz wrote so many that it's hard to know.
It's true. He wrote actually over 18 books in the fields of theology, of ethics, of Talmud. I think a good foundation book. Actually, one of the projects I'm working on with JPS is to create an updated version, but he wrote a book that every rabbi and educator, certainly in Cantor at the New York School, learned almost by heart. But he wrote a book called Choices in Modern Jewish Thought, where you can understand how he came to his theology because of the ways in which it's important to have the foundation of how he saw modern theology, right, since Herman Cohen, right? So since the turn of the century primarily, but including Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, the first chief rabbi of Palestine, in pre-state Israel. He has chapters about Soloveitchik, the great Orthodox thinker. In the second edition, he has a section on feminist Jewish theology. So, and Kaplan and Heschel, and I'm not sure if Fackenheim is in there as a separate thinker, but as all the options, all the ways in which thinkers have tried to understand what it means to have a life with God in the modern era, and what it means and how it can claim us. I would say that's one book. And if you enjoy that, then really his, tour de force, his main work of theology is called Renewing the Covenant. So those would be the first two books, but I'm also happy to share with Mark a bibliography with some recommendations. I've also written a couple of shorter pieces about his theology, which I'm happy to share too. And if you Google my name and Borowitz, you can probably see them online.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you, Judy.
Arnold Englander, please.
Thank you. Rabbi, can you just expand on what you were briefly saying about the self? I'm a little bit confused about how the self fits in with these three elements.
So in pre-modern times, that's a great question. In pre-modern times, not just in Judaism, but there wasn't so much focus on the individual as an individual. The individual is part of a community, and it was the community, the city or the state or the church that would protect the individual. And the individual mattered in as much as they were part of a collective, right? So in fact, there's a midrash about where, when Moses is up on Sinai and it seems like the Jewish people are, we're down below having a party with an idolatrous party with a golden calf and God knows what else. God says to Moses, I don't need you, quite literally in the Torah. Get down from the mountain. I don't need you. If you're not representing a people, I'm not about an individual relationship with you, which is very unique to Judaism. I'm about a relationship with the people. So it's all about the community. It's all about the minyan. It's not necessarily about, how an individual feels, about their sexuality or anything else. And so that's a pre-modern view. And an earlier modern view, gradually the self and the conscience that might argue with, in Kant's case, with religion or with the state, comes to have a voice. This is in all of Western culture, right? The individual as a, what I mean by sovereign is that you have the capacity to make a decision about yourself and your life and whether or not you believe in God and whether or not you're going to, I don't know, take communion, fast on Yom Kippur, what have you. I hope nobody's offended by that comparison, but I'm trying to take the most, sort of extreme cases in two traditions. And so in Judaism, it becomes, very clear that, and I think this is a big issue today, is that the Jewish people is more or less divided into two or three very, very different elements, Orthodox and non-Orthodox. All the non-Orthodox movements are really together and are so similar that he didn't even speak about them separately for the most part. So once you're not having halakha guide your individual behavior, then what guides it? So that's where the sovereign self comes in. It's all of you today, from this morning to Ne'ilah and breaking the fast on Yom Kippur, you are deciding what you're doing, how you're doing it, whether you're doing it, right? So that's the self. In Borowitz's theology, he's asking, he's basically saying, wouldn't a serious modern non-Orthodox Jew, not being directed by halakha and the rabbis who determine it, a serious liberal Jew has to take all of these three things into consideration, not just what I like for myself, whether, it works for me or not. I've had students who say, well, the Aleinu doesn't work for me, right? Or just to take an example that actually happened, I was teaching rabbinic students, but also I shouldn't be making decisions just about what's comfortable for me. I should have in mind how is what I'm going to do influence, not me the rabbi, me the individual, or you. What you do, what is it going to mean for those who come after you, those who see you in the community, in shul, whether or not you have children or nieces and nephews, other people looking to you are influenced by you. So you want to take them into account. If you value what your parents and grandparents or what our tradition says, you want to take that into account. And all of this is remembering the whole, what this is really about. All of this, our existence, especially on this day, it's about God. It's about, in a theology, in any theology, it's primarily about God and what God still wants of us. And how do we respond to that? So I hope this was helpful. Obviously, I'm trying to summarize here a half a century worth of thinking and teaching and writing.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have some more questions. We have Bob Saunders and then Mark Schlossberg. Bob?
Thank you. Rabbi, this may be a bit of an impertinent question, but you stated that the Jewish self is primarily and personally involved with God. So to what extent does that require a faith, or does it assume a faith or require a faith in God? Because in my view, for many modern Jews, that's a problem.
So Bob, I'd want to ask you, how is it a problem? But I hear your point. There are secular folk who I've studied Borowitz with who say, there's no place in this theology for me because I'm not a theist. I don't believe that there is a God or that I have a relationship with that God. And that is where I think Borowitz is very Kaplanian, meaning he's thinking along the lines of where one of the greatest thinkers of American Judaism, Mordecai Kaplan, who was brought up Orthodox and trained at the seminary and taught at JTS for many, many decades, and then ultimately is a founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. For Kaplan, that reliance on an involvement with God is exactly that which pushes many Jews away from their tradition. And so Kaplan saw God as a source or a power within us that pulls us toward our tradition and toward good ethical behavior and the folk ways, right? The rituals and the the other, other holidays and activities that we engage in help us to become that better person. And that God is really that source in us, making us lean toward being that better person. So Borowitz's theology is really about helping you to have a sense of God in your life. And obviously that's going to sound differently to each one of us. But he really thought that we had lost a sense of a commanding presence. And I think if we think about what, and I would even ask you, what really, Bob, right? I just can't see everyone again. What really motivates you? What at the end of the day determines your behavior?
Well, yeah.
If you think that there's a higher power?
I fell asleep for a part of it. Yeah, yes, you did.
I think, look, I can't speak for anybody but myself.
What
does
he finally say?
Somebody needs to mute themselves, please.
I think that for many people, it's a question of doubt. It's not hard and fast. It's I don't think people actually could say what they're really motivated by, or at least not one overriding motivating factor. I think we're motivated by a number of different concerns: family, friends, religion, what have you. And a faith in God isn't, for many people, the determining factor. It may be something there, and probably many people have certain doubts. I mean, you can't really look at history in the 20th century or in your own individual life and not have some concerns or questions. So it's hard to have a faith in the God that is described in the Torah.
Right, exactly. So what Borowitz is saying, though, is that if you don't have God grounding you, then we might as well end up at Auschwitz and Hiroshima again.
Right.
If we count only on people and on the impulses of people.
So the problem is there are two unacceptable alternatives.
Right.
Obviously the result of Hiroshima is not acceptable to anybody, but also a blinded, unthinking, uncritical belief in a God is difficult for many people to have.
Right. So, and what he's offering is I would say more of a balanced view, that whatever experience and view you have of God is also going to be balanced by your experience of your own experience.
Right.
And your experience of the Jewish people and the wisdom of the past, the best thinking of the moment, and the future. So you're actually operating not only for yourself and your own experience of God and tradition. But you're right, I think it remains a problem. I mean, and I think the problem of faith is a deep one. How Heschel puts it is that, we may be, and he even has a beautiful poem that I was sharing during these days, I can send it to you also, of, a Heschel being angry at God and being angry at God's absence or angry at what God has allowed to happen. And he actually has this beautiful poem originally in Yiddish that, are you ready for this? Sure. That on the high holy days especially, we also need to be able to forgive God for the ways in which God isn't, the world carries on in its ways and humanity carries on in its ways, that God may have created the world, but humanity has ultimately free will about what we do and about what we do to our world and what we do to other people.
Right.
So I think, Bob, I like how you put it, that there are a couple of bad choices, right? It's the question for all of us is in these imperfect choices, and I think all theologies by definition do have this problem. But if we sense that there's something greater and more powerful than ourselves, then the question remains: what does it demand of you? What is your duty, and where does it come from?
And I think that sense of something greater than the self, I think that's present for many, many people, but they just don't know exactly what it is, and it's hard to see it in the world.
Yeah.
Well put, thank you.
We still have some more questions, Bob, if I can just move on.
Sure, sorry.
Yeah, no, it was very interesting discussion, and I think that interaction with the rabbi was very important. We have Mark Schlossberg, and then we have Eliza.
Yeah.
Mark,
And
please.
I just
I
want
have a
to
question
add
too.
that,
Who's that?
Virginia, but I don't
Virginia.
think you can see me.
No, okay, thanks, Virginia. I put you down. Go ahead. Mark, please.
yeah, in listening to the discussion, it was both lecture and discussion, it was great. I just wanted to add another book that's really helped me. I've run study groups on this stuff. It's a Jewish theology on human relationships. And it's a book called The Place Where You Were Standing is Holy. And it talks specifically, not the same way, but in a complementary way, about the three relationships you have. It starts with God, yourself, and the other. And then it moves on to the earth and stuff. But the whole premise is you're making space for something, right? And you're accepting them on their terms. And that may mean challenging God. You know, to Bob's thing, it's not just to share. I see there is an element of faith, but I don't see it as unthinking devotion. I see it as a very deep thought of me making a choice, and to what extent that choice is. There's a spectrum, right? So it's different for me. But this book I found very helpful, and you may find it, you know, to the whole group, you may find it very useful as well. It's a great read. I've been reading it over and over. That's it.
Thank you. There's another book I would recommend, as long as we're expanding our list here, is a wonderful book for the high holidays that I would recommend for everyone right now to read. And it's by Rabbi Alan Liu, and the title is essentially, "This is Real, and You Are Completely Unprepared."
Yeah, that's a good book.
I think that's the title, more or less, right?
Yeah.
You reminded me of it. Thank you. Other questions, Mark?
Yes. Elisa, did you still want to ask a question?
Yeah, that's it.
No, it was answered with Bob's
Okay,
question.
thanks.
Thank you.
Virginia Solomon.
When you were talking, Rabbi, historically about the fact that the focus on the self is more postmodern, I wondered if you might comment a little bit on the Mishnah and the Gemara, because as I, in my limited understanding and knowledge of them, understand the questions to be posed kind of, if not by individuals, by small schools of individuals. I always think of them as being questions that, you know, center on, they may involve the community, but that the interrogation is more as a result of an individual questioning.
Well, that's such an excellent question. Tell me your name again. I can't see it.
Virginia.
Virginia.
Oh, Virginia. Thank you. That's a very important question, and I didn't do it justice. But so in a pre-modern world, right? Mishnah, Gemara, Bible, through the Middle Ages, and in our prayer books, right? We speak about the royal we, right? Hatanu, Avinu Malkeinu. It's not my God, it's our God, right? So we're primarily as an Israel, the group. And the Talmud and the Mishnah allow for questions to be posed by individuals who are part of a school of thought or a group. But the responses to them, if they're behavioral, if they're not stories, if they're not agadah, but they're halacha, they're going to determine behavior. The decision is made by a school, a whole branch, rabbinic branch, primarily the descendants of the house of Hillel, the academy according to Hillel. And I, the individual, if I don't think that, what's a good example? That the determination that chicken is meat, which it wasn't always thought of that way by all the rabbis, right? I'm not going to be able to eat and be part of the Jewish people unless I accept that ruling that chicken falls in the Basari category. You see, right? I, as an individual, might have preferred that minority opinion that fowl and is like fish. Is everybody with me?
Yeah.
Right. Fowl is like fish, and therefore I should be able to have my. I'm a vegetarian, so forgive me if my examples aren't great, but I should be able to have my chicken yogurt dish.
Right.
Right, or my Parmesan chicken dish. not veal, but chicken. I should be able to do that, right? But no,
I hope not.
that's not how the halakha of kashrut has come down to us. And of course, the other thing is, whether I want to be part of a minyan or not, whether I think, women should have certain roles or not, right? All of these things are determined for me, even though there are voices that may voice questions. So I hope that's helpful. So, and in the modern era, the individual's voice in the liberal world becomes, too significant, right? It's part of what I think concerned Borowitz in the, in the 1960s. He wrote a book called it was the first book about sex for Jews in that period. And he was really concerned about the sexual behavior in the 1960s on the college campuses and elsewhere. And he felt that was about autonomy. If it's all about me, then I'll just do whatever what feels good to me. Drugs, sex, who cares about the other person, much less the community. Right, so I'll do whatever I want to do just because I feel like it. And so Judaism, in a postmodern context, is saying, okay, we're not limiting your autonomy by halakha, right, by what we call the four walls of halakha, but it's going to get slightly limited. And this is why this is such a challenge to those of us who, what can I say, we love our autonomy. We love being able to make our own decisions. But what if I limit it just a bit? I limit it so that if you need a minyan, I'll be there. I'll limit it enough to have my kashrut in my house consider chicken meat, because I want to be able to have you all, and kosher eating folks to my house for a meal. Right? It might be more convenient. There were Reform Jews who wanted to have Shabbat early Reform Jews in Europe who wanted to have Shabbat on Sunday and stop circumcising and have the prayer book totally in English. Those are just three examples of things that actually didn't happen. They didn't stick, but it was about making things more comfortable for all of us. So a postmodern approach is saying, actually, we do limit our autonomy for the sake of the collective, for the sake of the covenant. I hope that was helpful.
It is, but it's still interesting to me that the questions that are posed seem to come from individuals, even though the answers may be imposed on the community.
That's very true, because you're right. There is a dignity to the individual and the question, but you may not like the answer, right?
Right. Thank you very much.
Sure. I love that question.
I see Peter has another thought or question.
Rabbi, I just wanted to ask you how Borowitz influenced your life and your own theology. And what's your theology?
Yeah, no, in lots of ways he did. I was, when I met him, I was a bit more orthoprax or orthodox in my theology, which is part of why we got along, because he was, so God-centered and halakha and prayer-centered. That we always found ourselves in the very small minyanim that were happening for mincha, let's say in the afternoon at HEC. Actually, one of the talks that I referred to earlier, of one of the last 5 talks that you can find on the website on hec.edu, if you put in my name and his name, he talks about actually how we met. So you can see that there. And I actually gave a eulogy, which you can also find if you put in both of our names. And the title of it is Loving God, Loving Torah, Loving Others. And that eulogy is a lot about his influence on me. There are things that have, been absolutely, I'm a student of his, and then there are areas in which I'm not. For instance, I think I'm a more active Zionist than he was. So certainly, I made Aliyah and became a Hebrew speaker. My husband is a 4th generation Israeli, and our kids were all born in Israel. And we believe speaking Hebrew to them is essential. I think I was not obviously, but it's probably obvious that I was more open-minded, certainly, and it was absolutely clear to me that human beings who love individuals, not necessarily of the gender identity that you might expect them to, that their love is as holy as the way I love my husband, and that their families are as sacred and beautiful as our family is. So we differed on those things very significantly, but there was a moment when he made in a lecture, in a talk, a kind of an inappropriate joke. And he realized that it was inappropriate, but everyone was, he had this very towering and very intimidating presence for most people who knew him. And he made a joke, and everyone was really just kind of too afraid to tell him that it was inappropriate. And we were going out to lunch that afternoon, and he said, you know, Rachel, I would like to hear your honest response to the lecture and if there was any problem. And I said, well, if you really want to know, I think there was a problem, but I think, you know, by and large, it was brilliant and blah, blah, blah. And I just kind of skirted the issue. And he said, no, if you want to be in a real chavruta with me, right? And if you're truly my student, you will, you know, basically learn better to argue with me, learn better to correct me. And you have to be able to tell me when I'm wrong. And that was a real turning point. And it led actually to, I was one of the 3 people who spoke at a big event for his 80th birthday, which was in 2009. I know that because I was about to give birth to our son, who's now 11, Yedidia. And he asked us specifically, three of his students, you can also find this, to argue with him, argue with parts of his theology, because he said the best chavruta in the Talmud and the best, you know, relationship between rabbis in the Talmud is between 2 people who argued with each other, and argued with each other so much that there would be, you know, dozens and dozens of counter arguments that one would make whenever the other one would make a statement. And that was a very important, and as you can see, a very intense relationship. But I expect no less of my students today. So that's a pretty big influence, right? To try to carry on that model of being a teacher and a rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. I think we're unless anyone has any other comments or questions, I think we can sort of, and I think that's a beautiful note on which to end today's study session with you. And I want to really thank you so much for being with us remotely, as it were, but giving us the benefit of your wisdom and learnings, and some great insight into Rabbi Borowitz and his theology. And wish you and your family a Shana Tova, and everybody else as well a Shana Tova, and hope that the coming year will be one of good health and happiness, and that we'll all be able to physically be together sometime soon. Not sure when, but hopefully sometime soon. With that, I'll bring this to an end and thank everybody, and thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks.
Shabbat
Thank
shalom,
you.
Shana Tova.
Shabbat shalom and Shana Tova.
Well done. Well done.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Everyone be well.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Rabbi Rachel, we'll be in touch. We'll be in touch, Austin.
I look forward to it, Mark. Thank you for everything.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.